everyone. Thank you again for being here. I think we've had a very constructive set of lunchtime conversations as well. My name is Clea Bourne. I am the organizer whose name comes first in the alphabet. And I bring you greetings from Goldsmiths, which had hosted this event the first time around. For those of you who were there, and I see one or two people who were, we were in the building known as Deptford Town Hall, and that building is actually under student occupation at the moment. A very important set of protests by students of colour looking at a range of issues, not least to do with Deptford Town Hall itself, which has a very interesting facade. If you ever pass through Deptford again, do stop and take a look at the statuary on the front of the building, which represents the slave trade. Although according to my senior management, that is contested. And another very important issue the students have been raising has been to try and invoke or to invite Goldsmiths into the raging discussion now about reparations. And our senior management has written what I think, for senior management, quite a thoughtful document in response to the students. But one of the points that they've made is the very kind of point that we are investigating in this kind of gathering. Their point is that Goldsmiths as we know it today, as an institution with the name, began in 1904 and therefore has nothing to do with slavery. Well, exactly. So I think we're going to be spending a very interesting set of weeks going forward, both the staff as students, pointing out what the different traces are, because traces really matter, and you can't just begin history in 1904 ignoring everything that went behind, or thinking that indeed it's over, that history is somehow over. And that brings me to the discussion that we're going to be having in this particular dialogue. We're joined by representatives from two really, really interesting organizations. I have to my right Louise Purbrick, who is from Traces of Nitrate, and the website I believe is tracesofnitrate.org. That's right. Okay. And to my left, we've got Hannah McLean, who is from the Museum of British Colonialism. Do you want to just pop in the website now so that people can have a look?
Oh, yeah, it's museumofbritishcolonialism.org.
Okay. Yeah. So, we're going to be talking about traces and restoration in this dialogue. And I think in a way we could also be talking about traces of restoration or restorative traces in a way. And I'll explain what I mean. So Traces of Nitrate points out on the very front page of their website that commodities are shapeshifters, which is an idea I absolutely love. And as they point out, nowhere more true than in a discussion of nitrate, which materially changes, which has archaeological traces, it has ownership traces, it has chemical traces, including the treatment of the chemical itself and those offshoots. It has land traces, it has water traces, and of course all of these combine to have traces on the lives of human beings. So I think that's a very interesting idea then to bring together, to combine in a discussion with the Museum of British Colonialism, which has been realized to creatively communicate a more truthful account of British colonialism. So it is what the organization terms a form of restorative history, and I particularly like that word, restorative, because that's not just about restoring truths that had been perhaps concealed or hidden, or in the manner of the British Museum, packed into a basement somewhere where no one is ever allowed to see it. But also I think restorative is important as an idea because it is healing, and because I think it's also invigorating. And I certainly hope that that's one of the things you're going to be able to take away from this event, to be both invigorated and reinvigorated into areas that you may want to become more activist in, or maybe are conducting research in. So I'm going to stop there and begin, I think, with Louise, because you're going to be speaking also to...
So there's a PowerPoint that's going to run behind my head. Thanks, Paul, for putting it on the screen where, although it's smaller, the definition will be good. So the PowerPoint will just run as I'm talking, and if you wanted in questions to go back to any of the images, then maybe we could do that then. It's a PowerPoint about a piece of work called Trafficking the Earth, And so I'm going to talk around that a little bit, and then about the piece of work itself and the strategies we've used there to show traces of nitrate in that work. Okay, I'm hoping as well today that I'm going to talk particularly to Paul's opening question, which was around what difference does it do if we know the colonial traces to current debates. So I wanted to talk to that, and also some of the questions about land capitalism that Casey raised today, and also about the not really the economies of debt, but a kind of capital in its invisibility, so its invisible presence. I wanted to talk, which is from when Jerome was speaking. I might need his help if he's still here to talk about Peru. There's a moment where I wanted to explain the way in which Peru and London affect this story, which is mostly in Chile, that I'm going to begin. Okay, so our work began with the album that you're just seeing now. It's a photographic album that was sent from Chile to Anthony Gibbs in London. And those people that study for Nitrate Capital, you might know his name, Anthony Gibbs. And Anthony Gibbs and Sons were a really important merchant house through the 19th century. Made their money first from guano. And when they made their money from guano, they made their money from more or less slavery, Chinese indentured servants on rocks outside Peru scraping shit into bags was how they made the money. And then they moved into the nitrate market. So Gibbs received an album of photographs. And those albums are traces. If you know anything about photography, it is the trace of light, and it's the trace of time and space that's captured on a surface. So sent back to London through the same route that goods travelled anyway, came this document to Anthony Gibbs. And he received it, he says, as a very handsome present. And if the profit that could be returned from this oficina, the field, a nitrate field, Oficina Alianza, was equally as handsome, he'd be very, very grateful to his nitrate manager, Mr. Smale was his name. And that particular album tells the story, and we tell the story of the album. We use the album to go backwards and forwards between the City of London and the desert, the Atacama Desert, which stretches from Santiago, a little bit above Santiago, up towards Peru, and to tell those stories. And we use particular strategies of documentation. So we use a form of realism, I suppose, to assert the reality of extraction. So I should tell you a little bit about the processes of extraction itself, because nitrate has disappeared, except it is everywhere. It's in our polluted waters, it's nitrogen, it was exported as a fertiliser. So its origins as a material in Europe comes from urbanisation and from capitalism. So there was a food shortage in Europe, and that was to do with the growing cities. German farmers in particular liked nitrate for its quickening effect, so it made beet that fed a cattle market that then fed the meat for the cities. It had this very rapid growing effect. So nitrogen in its natural state is only found in the Atacama Desert, the driest climate in the world bar the Arctic, and it's just below the surface. It's below rocks called caliche. It's very, very easy to extract, actually. Like a lot of mining, it's not complicated. Explode the surface, dilute, essentially lixiviate the rocks, break them up, and then you leave salt and sand, and then you have nitrate, which is a sodium form. 80% of our world's atmosphere, and the kind of market in nitrate was a really short moment from about the 1870s to 1914, and in the First World War, one of the goods that were blocked initially in the Allied blockade of Germany was nitrate. So the first naval battle for the First World War was in the Falklands, and it forced the artificial fixing of nitrate by Haber and Bosch. So the story of nitrate is absolutely central to the story of Europe. It's the story of the chemical industry, and it's the story of the First World War. And so the Allies threw over natural nitrate from Chile in the fields of France, and we were returned artificial nitrate back onto those fields. So it's absolutely central, and it's absolutely invisible to our main stories. But it is also central to the making of financial capital. So if we took Gibbs in Alianza, and the album was sent in 1889 and it arrived in London in 1890. Anthony Gibbs went on to be the head of the Bank of England, and in fact made most of his money during the First World War because of the increase in the value of nitrate at that time. And he's a very important financier. I think he was bought out by HSBC. I think they're fracking probably now as we speak somewhere. But so his company was particularly important, and he used his money to fund Keble College in Cambridge. He also used his money to buy Tintersfield outside Bristol. High Tractarian. All of his work celebrates the sort of value of labour. So it looks quite kind of Morrison, arts and crafts movement in terms of architecture. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Keble College. Anyway, exactly. It is. That's the place. And then, his wealth is elite and very civic, but he was having a row in 1890 with another nitrate king. So his name was John Thomas North, and John Thomas North, he controlled the railways, and I want to tell a little bit more of his story. But he controlled the railways, and nitrate was extracted fairly cheaply. Once you've exported all English machinery, you have rounded up gangs of labourers from Peru and from Chile and from Bolivia, and you've promised them 3 pesos a day, which was 2 more than you get if you worked in the land. But by the time you paid for your journey, and by the time you bought water and you've hired your spade, you're already in debt to the person that you're working for. So and it's a form that was used in the making of many railways in Peru as well. So, and you're paid not in money but in a company script, which is the only economy to buy your water, to buy your food. So you are indentured, and you're probably in debt already. We talked to people and they said what they earned in a day, they spent in a day to keep themselves alive. So you've been rounded up to an inhospitable place in the desert. And then another English speculator and capitalist, John Thomas North, bought the railways, and the main money was made in the railway charges. So control of the railway lines would be, if you've got bags of nitrate and you need to get them to the ports because you're exporting them to German farmers, you can, and there's a monopoly of the railways, you can raise the price of carriage any amount you like. So Anthony Gibbs did not work Alianza until he had bought his own railway, and he was having a row, and that row occurred at the time of the Civil War in Chile in the 1890s, and it was a war where the then President Jose Balmaceda was arguing for nationalisation of the nitrate lands, and Thomas North and Gibbs were kind of arguing over who might control those railways and who might kind of lobby in the Congress that supported more or less kind of English interests against a presidency that was looking at forms of nationalisation of land, maybe. Eventually a railway was built and Alianza went ahead, and so it tells a story of competing forms of British capital, so competing forms between John Thomas North, who was unlike Gibbs, who spent his money on Keble College. He was a gambler. He ran greyhounds, which are stuffed in museums, and he also had huge parties in London. He dressed up as Henry VIII, and those huge parties and the publicity ensured speculation in his shares. And so actually more important even than the nitrate that's in our soils now and in our rivers was actually the speculation. So, and he sold in a losing market to himself. He inflated his shares. He had this kind of quite a lot of publicity about him. In the Crimean War, there was a reporter, who I'm going to forget his name, very important Crimean War reporter, who went with North to do a tour of the nitrate lands, and that was reported in the Illustrated London News. So already the speculation, the nothingness of nitrate was reproduced in that financial market. So it's really important, kind of as a sort of an allegory for Chilean capital later on, for the ways in which nitrate figured in the Chilean labour movement and in the support for Aondi. So there are memories of exploitation that were part of the attempt to nationalise both nitrate and copper in the 1970s. So as nitrate fell away after the First World War, American Guggenheims moved in and able to manufacture nitrate, lower grade nitrate. So there was a Guggenheim process. and people know who the Guggenheims are and their significance and so on. So the Guggenheim process that we're able to kind of work on the residues of nitrate. So the desert's being turned into a slag heap and American capital is moving in. And what was important is that in those nitrate mines were movements to organise and to demand nationalisation of mining. And so, for example, Chacabuco, which was one of nitrate oficina by President Ondi, was turned into a national monument. And then when the US Pinochet coup came in 73 and tried to both nationalise nitrate and copper, that national monument was turned into a jail for the disappeared. And the Atacama Desert is also the place where the disappeared bodies ground up were dispersed, and people still look for the traces in the desert. So there are traces upon traces. There are traces in the photographs, there are traces in the material wealth of John Thomas North and of Anthony Gibbs, and there are traces in the landscape itself, because the Atacama is the driest place in the world. Things do not decay, so they remain in that landscape. So there's a kind of memory, I suppose, that's worked through opposition to the coup and through memories of the coup and through the stories that people are told and retold about nitrate workers within Chile. There's that kind of memory work of traces, but also structurally in Chile, and everybody here will know much more about this than me, so I'll just put it out there as to recognise that I kind of know some economic history, is that structurally the vertically integrated company was one that the Guggenheims developed, and what you could argue is that Chile becomes a kind of prototype of financial capital. So it's the Chicago boys that support the coup, and it's also the fear, I suppose people talked about the fear of risk, the fear not just of the nationalisation of copper, but the fear of the nationalisation of ITT, which was the telecommunications company, that would be held, that would be removed from American hands. So Chile, although appears peripheral, and maybe the story I'm telling doesn't, might seem strange or unusual, it's actually the story of global capital in lots of ways. Have I got any more time, or should I stop?
Yeah, you do. You have 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. So I wanted just to say that some of the kind of other legacies. So John Thomas North went on to work with King Leopold, so he knows where to go for super exploitation. John Thomas North, and Anthony Gibbs, he became the head of the Bank of England. Was really, really very successful, and then he gave his papers. So much of what you're looking at is now in the London Metropolitan Archives. So the archival residues as well, or archival traces. So our work has tracked between the archive and the landscape, between stories of labour and stories of capital. And the eventual work, Trafficking the Earth, what we do is those documents, all of the documents from archives, documents from the photography of that's created, are juxtaposed in this enormous piece of work, just simply juxtaposed to collapse time and space. And the work is around about 365 photographs, and it's been accessioned now, I'm very proud to say, by the Museo de Solidaridad Salvadoriana, so it's in Chile, as the actual objects, but it's a PDF, and so if people wanted to, I can give you the website and you can download it. So a smaller version is there, but the strategy is to kind of try and do what I was doing now, not so well in words, is to force together moments of time, force together the wealth of Keble and the exploitation in the desert in the 1890s, in order to see that time doesn't move in a linear fashion for global capital. It borrows time from the future and the past. It takes the Earth's materials and it crunches them together. And if we stop the separations of linear time, that might be one way of thinking about exploitation.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I'm going to move over to Hannah now for your discussion of a really important organisation. Thank you.
So I should start by saying that I'm here today in place of our co-founder Olivia, who wasn't able to make it. She's a lot more familiar with the history, but I will try to answer questions as best as I can. As Claire said, our museum has been realised to gather, share and comment on material and resources to do with British colonialism. and we were founded about a year ago now. And that's mainly because there is definitely a gap in the market in terms of how museums engage with and represent history to do with British colonialism. So we're currently made up of a team of all volunteers, so a lot of us are students or work in other places full-time. I'm an archaeology student. And we're also currently virtual, so we run temporary exhibitions. We just finished an exhibition at Belfast's Imagine Festival, which was in partnership with the Pat Finnecane Centre, which is a Northern Ireland-based human rights centre. And we have a policy that whatever exhibitions we run in the UK or elsewhere, we also hold in Kenya. But obviously this is all dependent on funding and opportunities. So the work we're doing at the moment is based in Kenya, and more specifically on the Mau Mau uprising and the Mau Mau pipeline. So the uprising took place between 1952 and 1960, and is what we consider probably one of the least well-known and understood episodes of British colonial history, in terms of what the details of which took place there, and how well that information has been disseminated. So during the emergency to deal with the insurgency, the British colonial government set up a pipeline of camps, and it's estimated by historians such as Caroline Elkins and David Anderson that there were over 100 detention camps, work camps, and emergency villages where Mau Mau fighters and even suspected Mau Mau fighters were taken. And the aim of the pipeline was essentially to sort of process these detainees so that they would come out of the other end as being able to contribute to colonial society, basically. And to achieve this, they believed that the fighters had to confess to having taken the Mau Mau oath, and then renouncing that they took the oath. And to do this, there was basically state-sanctioned torture and violence by the colonial secretary at the time. And importantly, the torture and violence that took place wasn't the actions of rogue officers, it was from top level down. So this sometimes resulted in deaths as well. So the Hola massacre, which I think that was just the 60th anniversary of, where 11 detainees were killed at Hola camp by colonial officers, and they attempted to cover it up by saying that the detainees had drunk contaminated water. And obviously that's just one example of the ways that there was a lot of external obfuscation at the time and up until now. So the camps were found from the coastal region at Lamu. There was one on Manda Island, all the way up to the northern region in Lodwar. And yet, 56 years after independence in Kenya, not only is the knowledge of these camps not known in the UK, but they're barely known in Kenya as well. So one of our co-founders, Chow, who is Kenyan, she only recently found out that her grandfather was Mau Mau, because it just isn't really talked about by a lot of people. So the work we're doing is to gather information through field work and through archival research and through oral history interviews, and to exhibit as much of the work as we can to make sure people's stories are more widely known. So in September we visited Nyeri, which is just north of Nairobi, it's about an hour out, and we visited two former camps called Guthi and Mweru. And these two camps have been converted into schools. So at Guthi, which is now called Kangabiri, the students, their dormitories are the former cells that detainees were kept in, and the principal's office is the former captain's office. At Kangabiri, the students aren't aware of the history of the site. At Mweru, the students they have some sort of understanding because there's a preserved torture room, which is this small sort of brick shack, and it's got a sign outside that says like Mau Mau torture room, basically. And we also visited Chinga Dam, which is an artificial lake in Nyeri that was constructed on the orders of a colonial officer who essentially wanted a lake where he could fish, and sail boats. And so to construct the lake, they destroyed lots of farmland. The owners of the farmland weren't compensated at the time, and they still haven't been compensated since. And the dam was actually built using labour from Othaya Works Camp, so using forced labour from the Mau Mau detainees. So our work is basically to visit these sites, and we're working on digitising this information. So on our website we have an interactive map of the locations of the camps. And we're working on building 3D models of the camps, and we're going to integrate that with testimonies and oral history interviews. So we visited, for example, a man called Mr. Wambugu Nyigi, who was at Hola camp actually during the massacre, and I think he was sent through about 7 different camps at the time. And so he was there during the massacre, and he was actually presumed dead and taken to a morgue, and he regained consciousness 3 days later. And his story has been in Kenyan media, but it's still not widely known, and that's just one of the hundreds of thousands of stories that are still not known today. So a lot of the veterans, a lot of them live in poverty. A lot of them haven't received compensation. There was compensation given to 5,000 after the 2009 court case against the British government, but the compensation was 19.9 million, but after legal fees, that was about £3,500 for each of the claimants. And, that was just 5,000 survivors, and there's hundreds of thousands of people that were in the camps. Have I got...
Yeah, you have time, 7 more minutes.
It's the repercussions of this lack of knowledge in both the UK and Kenya is what we're aiming to combat, essentially.
Okay, thank you. Now, I can hear so many different connections right now. I'm going to draw together some of those connections and then open it up to people to ask questions, and I'm sure to make their own connections and offer comments. First of all, Louise, as I was listening to your presentation, I thought it might be worth just sort of going back and explaining how I got involved with my co-organisers in the first place. Because I'm based in a media communications and cultural studies department, where by nature we are very interdisciplinary. So it was constantly surprising to me to visit maybe a political economy space and not to hear post-colonial studies brought in, or a post-colonial space where maybe economics hadn't been brought into play. And among the connections that I'm hearing, when you spoke, for example, about the importance of acquiring the railway as a monopoly in order to enable some of the movements of nitrates, and to think how very similar it is to what we're watching happening now with Google and Facebook in terms of monopolizing data movement, particularly on Western languages on the internet. And just to watch what is happening again in history, very much like the spread of railways during the Victorian era, where they had so much legal clout that it became a very long time before there was any sort of organized labor or even a recognition that there was a danger to allowing these sorts of monopolies, or even to acknowledging what these railway companies actually meant, which is very similar today, where Google and Facebook work very hard to have themselves described in one way so that you can't see them as another. So I think that's just, for me, one of the importances of recognizing what you explained very, very well, I thought, with not seeing global capital in linear fashion. Because we can see those monopolistic relationships reaching forward into the 21st century, having been enabled by legal structures that in many cases took, particularly in US law, a very long time to cement, but really inform much of what is happening in global capital today. Another connection that you made, which is very, very close to my own research interests, is in the way that global capital is promoted, particularly speculative activity. I mean, in my own work, I write about contemporary and historical forms of what we now today call PR, advertising, marketing, which are pursuits that have existed for hundreds of years, but under different names, conducted by different groups of people. But the idea of creating a moment of excitement and adventure is absolutely crucial to enabling speculative activity. And we see it again today. In my own current research, we're looking at fintech companies, which are based, for the most part, on forms of artificial intelligence and automation. And what you're typically seeing in the news right now is a lot of these companies are being exposed for not being artificial intelligence at all. They're sort of fake. Or engaging in exactly the kind of duplicitous behavior we expect from any companies in sort of a speculative moment. So that was another connection that I saw. And then moving on to Hannah's discussion of the importance of making colonial connections and bringing stories to light. I think unearthing stories, which I think is an activity that should be far more interdisciplinary than it is at the moment. For people who maybe take an anthropological approach to finance, that's part and parcel of their work. For many sociologists, that's the way that they work as well. For history as well. But there are some fields where history, telling stories almost seems as if it's too soft a way to do research. But in fact, it is one of the best ways to invoke public engagement and understanding and transmission of the importance of particular points. So I think the more that we can do storytelling in research, I think that's absolutely crucial to making some of the connections that we want to achieve. And then listening to the discussion that you had about the detention camps. It's how do we sit here in 2019 knowing that there are detention camps, just spreading everywhere around the world? That's something I find it very difficult to get my head around. But also to understand what real economic purpose these detention camps actually achieve. So I thought again of the way that detention camps are being used in the United States, for example. I think we're just going to wait to see the Republican manifesto for the next election to understand how those detainees will then be invoked into particular economic relationships. My current bet is that they will be offered some form of green card status if they contribute to building the wall. I just think it's just such a logical way to use those detainees. But it also reminded me about the way that coercion works rather differently in the 21st century, but in no less frightening a manner. I was listening to a presentation by my colleague Mirka Madiano the other day talking about how refugees are being organized through United Nations use of surveillance apps, which are very biometric in basis. So that in order to be in a particular camp and have access to things like food or work, you have to present yourself at various destinations to have your iris scanned. You don't need to present any other form of ID in order to be able to get food, in order to have somewhere to sleep for the night, in order to be able to get education for your family. So there isn't necessarily, in the 21st century form of detention, a sense of people being beaten with physical apparatuses, but they are no less controlled and inevitably brought into some form of capital relationship, whether it's to sort out the guy who needs the lake to fish in, or to actually become the basis for an entire industry, which would have been the case in Chile, in Peru, in so many other countries. So those are just some of the connections that I saw that are both a matter of interdisciplinary need to bring much of our research and storytelling together, but I thought that the point that you ended on in terms of thinking about temporality, everything that happened then continues to happen today. It's actually part of the same story that we see being enacted today. So I will actually stop here now to see what sorts of observations and questions that we have from the audience. That might begin to make further connections. Okay. Who would like to start us off?
I'm asking a question which is also a question I'm struggling with. Because in some of the work that I do, both as a scholar and as someone who participates in artistic projects, I work a lot with the concept of the trace, the ghost, and particularly the way that the present institutions are haunted by the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, the way that history rhymes, in certain ways. And I've been thinking about this sort of work as a kind of ghost work, as a way of working with kind of spirits in a very materialist sense that have come before. And I'm reminded that, as has been pointed out by many sort of historians of colonialism, one of the first things that colonists did upon arriving was to use religion as a means to sever the connection between colonized populations and their ancestors, to essentially insist that ghosts don't exist. Mm-hmm. And there seems to be a long history in the kind of narratives of empire that suggests that, in fact, that we can't tell history except in this, as you point out, this kind of linear fashion. That, and I'm reminded of then some of the scholarship that's come out in the last 30 or 40 years on ghosts. Avery Gordon's work on ontologies, Derrida's work on it, and many others as well. And so my question ultimately is, I feel intuitively and inherently that this work is extremely important right now, partly because on some surface level we seem to be repeating the horrors of the past in new form, as Clea mentioned, in terms of the exploitation of our data ghosts and more. But also that somehow, if we're able to tell better stories about what happened, we can both it allows us to think about a better kind of solidarity as well. That if we can understand that these ghosts are not just a ghost of particular people who've been robbed of history, of land, of resources, but really the ghosts that haunt all of us, then perhaps we can come through that as a project of coming into a new relationship with those that have become, by virtue of their subjugation to empire, our shared ancestors in a strange way. As problematic as that may be in certain ways as well. And I guess my question is, I have that intuition, I have that feeling, and I'm always curious about then, because I also live another part of my life as an activist, then how that becomes urgent in the public sphere as well. Because I feel I can get so into unpicking the kind of complex, interwoven histories of empire, capitalism, and patriarchy and other systems of power. And then when I come out from the archive, so to speak, and blink, here we are. And everything looks eerily familiar again. So unfortunately, this is not going to end in a simple question, but what do we do in that moment when we emerge from the archive? I think both of you have presented these kind of amazing projects that have in some way sought to make the lessons we can take urgent and haunting in the present in a transformative way.
Wow. Okay. If I tell one story about ghosts, and I have done some thinking with Avery Gordon, and ghosts in her writing are actually quite. They're resistance. They're forms of resistance. So the process of haunting is to bring the past into the present more forcefully. So you recognise. So she has the stuff. I left my notes at home, but the phrase from Avery Gordon that I think is important is that the ghost comes back through haunting, and it forces us to recognise where we are. So I think it's that kind of understanding of the past that makes us see. I'm not sure that they're our collective ancestors. I think we have to be really careful, because I think that they are. I think it's important that if an injustice didn't happen to you, that you understand your role as a witness.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So I think sometimes we're interested in documentary because it's to witness an inequality and exploitation that we know the world has inherited, that has been enacted upon somebody else who wasn't us. So I think that witnessing is important within that model of the ghost. But the ghostly presence began at the beginning, really. So when I worked with two photographers, Javier Ribas, who was also at the University of Brighton, where I'm based, and Ignacio Acosta, who's a Chilean, and Javier's in Barcelona, and Ignacio in Santiago, so you've got me today. But when Javier looked at this photographic album, he had a ghostly experience, which was he heard this song, which is the Cantata de Siege de Santa Maria de Escuela de Santa Maria. So it's the story of there was a strike on the 21st of December 1907, and Peruvians, Bolivians and Chileans, often who had been forced to compete against each other for kinds of jobs. So Chileans might be the foreman, and Bolivians might be the kind of ripio workers working on the slag heap. So there were ethnic divisions and racial divisions that were forced through the system, but there was a moment of unity. There was a huge strike against the script system and for higher wages. People walked through the desert to Iquique, which is a port, and gathered in the port. And they were represented by a committee, some of which were anarchists as well, who'd worked on the railways, and they were talking about going back to work, but they're going to be put on cattle trucks back without an agreement, because the agreement was, you go back to work and we might pay you more, and they said, no, we get the agreement now. And there was a deal done between the army, and they were, the deaths, the cantata says 3,000, but historians say more like maybe 500 to 1,000 were killed, first by machine gun and then by people running into the crowds, hacking into the crowds. And Javier remembered the song. He's Spanish, and he remembers it because he felt it was an anti-Franco song. It was around about the 1970s, and he thought it was, so for him, it was echoes of the end of a dictatorship. But in fact, what had happened, the reason he heard the song was the band that played it were in exile in Paris in the 70s. So the song was quite kind of broadly, was played over and over. It's very important now for the new folk tradition. In fact, the Smithsonian, America, has the only recording of it, and it was, Pinochet banned the song, and the recording was the recordings of it, replaying it was censored. But Javier recalls it, so he recalls his history in Spain in relation to looking at the album. So although that the ghost is sort of more spread across continents, I still think it's quite specific to those experiences of oppression. And I think that my role, and I'm not Spanish or Chilean, but my role has been to kind of work as a witness, I think, and to see those ghosts and try and work them rather than they're not mine, if that makes sense. They don't quite belong to me.
I wondered, so if we could bring this around to Hannah. I mean, Hannah, from an archaeological perspective, I mean, what sorts of discussions do you have in terms of bringing stories to light? What's your archaeological responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a grad student, but I think there is definitely an onus, I guess, to use more interdisciplinary well, not technologies, but yeah. So so my one of my lecturers, Gabe Mashenska, who works at UCL, who is involved with the museum and is how I got into this. He's very big on using all histories to understand better archaeology and archaeological landscapes, and especially the Mau Mau camps, because you know, a lot of them, the records are gone, most of the camps are gone. The ones that do survive are schools, and even the people working there and studying there don't know that they were camps. So the people that retain that knowledge are the veterans, and the veterans often don't get listened to. They aren't really heard, even in Kenya. So it is up to us as historians and archaeologists and anthropologists, in a sense, to find out these stories. But it definitely does have to be done in a sensitive manner, I suppose.
And I think there's also something, when you were introducing the museum at the start, you were saying that one of the imperatives is that any sort of exhibition that takes place in Britain, there must be a partner activity in Kenya.
Yeah.
So that's part of trying to achieve this, isn't it? There has to be a sense of balance.
Yeah, because I mean, our museum was basically set up by Olivia, who is she's white and British, and she lives in London, and she co-founded it with Charles, Susan, and Mary, who are Kenyan. And from the start, she's been adamant that there has to be a balance, because otherwise we're just sort of replicating. Replicating the legacies of archaeology and anthropology, where people would go to Africa and just...
I mean, that does remind me of many of the critiques that have taken place recently in terms of social media engagement with activist movements now, where, I mean, you were pointing out that it's important to establish that your position is one of witness and not necessarily involved, and yet slacktivism almost says, no, I'm on social media and therefore I'm involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think my... it's difficult because the material legacies of wealth, not ghosts, are here.
Yeah.
So I mean, so that in that sense, the colonial traces and the market is Gibbs. Not really so much John Thomas North, because he did spend his fortune actually gambling away. But anyway, but Gibbs, the fortune, they made a fortune, that fortune built other fortunes, so there are direct financial links, aren't they? So in a way, the victors, and Walter Benjamin says that something like that, even the dead are not safe from them, and in fact they're right, so the victors have continued, and I think that's what I want to be a witness, not a witness to because I like it, but just to say that money didn't go away, the material wealth is increasing. I mean, so that's what's really important, is to tracing the money and knowing where the money came from. I mean, Gibbs, of course, he was a slaver. He had an office in Liverpool, and Bright, who had plantations in the Caribbean, was his partner. I mean, the route they went, the route was via Australia. You know, so these are people whose connections are everywhere, and whose empire, financial empire, is not dead, have no ghosts. So I think the haunting metaphor is great, and we use it a lot, and it's so visible in Chile, but you don't get that in London, because London, we went to Bright's office, we went to Gibbs' office, and of course it's a building site, so it's erased in that moment of gentrification. It's really interesting. So there are traces that appear as traces because the money's fallen away and the past is visible. And other places, the material wealth is the dynamism of capital that grows and grows and grows and grows, and it appears new, forever new, not as a ghost, but as new money. And of course, it's old money. So, yeah.
Okay, yes.
I know David goes a lot on haunting, but sometimes I think the case of the Mau Mau is really interesting to think about the context of the themes of this conference, because it's only the reparations compensation claim made by those veterans that really blew open the torturous. I mean, what the British did in Kenya is, the necrotism is needed in terms of Britain's dominant memory of, in terms of British dominant memory of colonialism. So it's only the claim by those veterans which brought to light the so-called migrated archive, which is the hidden documents of British colonial crimes hidden away, which never would have come to light without that financial claim. And when we think about the resistance of reparations or to reparations, always in terms of money can't do anything about the past, but actually claims, financial claims, open up new histories. And they open up histories precisely in a way that blows apart Britain's notion itself of a tolerant, benevolent colonial power. There's an orgy of violence, of white rage in Kenya. And without those veterans making that financial claim, the half of that history wouldn't be known to the extent that it is. They're hidden. I mean, this wasn't found in a box. This was migrated and hidden away, which only makes one think, what else is hidden in terms of Britain's colonial crimes?
If we continue our today's practice of just introducing yourself, how?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, no, that's fine. Go ahead.
My name's Kathy Bergen, from the University of Brighton. So I just wanted just to maybe, because the Mau Mau is such a still occluded moment, it should be the centre of British history, and so recent. And there are connections, of course, to the denial of crimes there and the recent denial of crimes related to Billy Sunday shootings. So just all of those connections, I think, is important when those arguments against reparations come up, that actually reparations changes history. The claim for reparations change history.
Okay.
It is a very concrete example of the way in which it was done.
And so you used language where you talked about how it can blow up some of these links, which I quite like, but also it can be restorative. So,
yes.
So both violence that is actually necessary, but then a form of healing. And I'm going to have a quick scan round for questions. Nadine, did you have a question?
I had a comment, so
okay.
No question.
Okay, so I've got, if you go, and then the lady behind you, and then over here, and then I'll come over to this side, yes.
Sure, and I just wanted to thank you, Louisa. When I think about bauxite and aluminium, and I'm actually thinking about, we know that the military planes dropped people, right? They were literally not burned up, but dropped. And I think about aluminium that built those planes. Yes. We know Jamaican aluminium was tied to the Korean War, Vietnam War, and I suspect that it ties in there. So that's my first flash. And thank you around temporality. I use Marie Clement's Burning Vision, which connects uranium mining to Japan. Like, it's a very direct connection. In fact, indigenous people, then a contingent of elders went to Japan to speak about, we were mining this for health. That's what we were told. And what actually happened. So it's actually a blueprint for how I do my work. Yeah. But I also wanted to thank you around the witnessing piece, because I know moving through archives, I deal with, I literally, things drop off shelves. The hour, I'm like, okay, or I get the wrong box, but it's not the wrong box. It actually has something in there that's been miscatalogued at the National Archive in the UK, which, there's a whole long list actually beyond of all the countries that those hidden boxes were. The Caribbean's on it. I've spoken to indigenous Guyanese folks who are like, we gotta go look in those boxes. So, especially around decolonization movements. But I wanted to just quickly end by talking about an indigenous Siberian author who's at Manchester, Olga Ultargashiva, who talks about the ghosts of the Gulag, and I think it's really important. She's talking about how the indigenous people in Siberia deal with those camps, that the roads are literally the bones of the prisoners that were just like built into the road, but that those ghosts are not negotiable. They're not their ghosts. And even though they've done what they would do with ancestors, those ghosts actually wipe people's like sanity and their own well-being. So I wanted to really talk about, and it's a really beautiful paper. I have it here. I can send it to people if they need, but it's quite critical around the force of ghosts and how indigenous people are dealing with something moved into their territory that has an afterlife that is literally dangerous for them and their well-being in that place. So I just wanted to kind of add that piece.
Okay, let me capture the two other questions and then take your responses before I move over to this side of the room. Yes.
I'm Francisca from the University of Chile in Germany. The whole conversation we're having at the moment also brings me to the question about how we as critical scholars deal with our family histories and how they are intertwined with colonialism, especially we as white Europeans here in the room. For me, coming from in Germany, the debate about German colonial history is only at the very beginning. It's quite different in Britain here, of course. Only about 10 years that things are changing a bit, and in Germany it's quite normal that you think about how your grandfathers have been involved into the Wehrmacht and the war atrocities in the Second World War, but this is normally where family history stops and no one asks more about it. And then on the other hand, especially when it comes from South Germany, it's quite normal that you have some people who have emigrated to the States somehow, and this kind of immigration is always portrayed as something well, sad, romantic, adventurous, and innocent. And it's only about a couple of months that I personally found out that I have relatives in North Dakota who came there in the 1860s and were involved into the creation of the state, and also founded some law firms which were involved in litigation issues and probably also in land issues. And for me, it's a very personal, training and fucking question, how I'm going to make sense of this kind of ghosts, to put it like that, and how I'm going to deal with that kind of family history, also in terms of reparation and my own role in being a critical scientist. I think this is something that may, correspond to many other family histories you might have here in Rue.
Okay, thank you very much for that particular interjection. Yes.
Hi, I'm Rhiannon. I was wondering about methodology.
Yes.
So, like, obviously the colonial kind of inheritance of how we kind of begin to kind of contextualize artifacts and how we kind of methods we use to kind of understand history, like it's then inherited. And I was wondering if there's anything you were doing within your own work to try and kind of unpick them and have a kind of more, liberating kind of methodology.
Okay, so I don't know which bits you want to take. We've got Kathy talking about the importance of reparations, sort of bringing all sorts of ghosts to light. Nadine's various comments and fantastic office of papers that people need to read, looking at all sorts of connections with mining. Francesca talking about reflections as critical scholars, and how you actually bring those to the fore. And then, of course, methodologies. I don't think you need to take all, but grab the ones you can, and then I'll come over to you.
It's that the witnessing when things come out of boxes is really interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's to do with you're on a path to try and reveal something about the past, and it comes at you. And I think it is interesting, and I think there's something about if you begin to take responsibility, which may be a way of thinking about wider than families, if you begin to take some kind of historical responsibility and just look, you can see. So I think there's something about that which sounds a bit romantic, but it is to do with maybe a notion of a witness, or to do with trying to see connections beyond your moment. And they do seem to jump out at you somehow or other. So, for example, Javier, when he was that album is in Pamplona, so it's in the University of Navarra in Pamplona, and he was exhibiting there, and that's when he went to go to look at the archive, and it's actually album 12. So there's something about a kind of collision between past and present that we have to accept this is also methodological in a way. It's actually to try and see your moment in its constellation, which is from Walter Benjamin, to see the past as a kind of swirl rather than as a neat journey that we are connected in those particular ways. So in terms of methodology, is we have as a group, we talk to each other a lot. So we talk, so we work collaboratively. We work with people, so we work with Chileans, and so we kind of track between the archive and the landscape. So, and then we deliberately look for traces, and when those are recorded, we try to record them as accurately as possible. So there's one problem in some ways, is that we use documentation, which is of course the tool of colonialism as well. So that is a problem. And so often when we exhibit, we try and exhibit a context around those things, and so we exhibit the album itself, and also just really honest, I suppose. So we also write, and sometimes we feel that processes of documentation sometimes are removed from the moment at which they're taken and they stand as the truth. So we will talk and say this is who we are and this is what we're doing and these are our connections. So some of it's to do with integrity as a methodology, trying to recognise yourself in your moment. And the other one is to try using the mechanisms of representation to offer a story that's incisive enough to make a difference. You know, to produce change. The financial reparations and Chilean letter is I'd have to have a think about it. You'd have to replay the whole of global capital, wouldn't you? You'd have to, you know. So I think it's something about. Reparations are often aimed at the state, but
Yes.
financial institutions, and really, it is the story of it's the story of British capitalists and speculators. The state didn't arbitrate very much, except at the very. There's a. Yeah, I'll shut up. That's enough. Yeah.
I mean, just thinking about what you're saying, where the state didn't necessarily arbitrate very much. I think one of the things that's always intriguing to me with material that I've used in research, or indeed in just in sort of reading groups, is how much we have to remember how close state relationships are with global capital. And we see this with various people who work on elite structures, to understand that we're talking about people who attended the same school, or attended the same college of a particular university, or belong to the same sorts of social clubs and networks. So that there are, until we start looking for the traces, we don't necessarily see them. There are all these sorts of behind-the-scenes connections that are also important to bring to the forefront. So what may not look like the state is very much an important set of state relationships. Hannah, I wondered then, in terms of the museum as a project, whether there continue to be any sorts of discussions about methodology, for example.
Yeah.
We talked about balance, but...
Yeah. So in terms of methodology, we're quite similar in terms of talking to each other, but also to veterans, as I said, and also people working in Kenya in museums. So we really started with, the museum basically started in Olivia's living room with Livia and Chow, our co-founders, going through the books that have been written about Mau Mau and the pipeline, so by Caroline Elkins and David Anderson and others, and finding their maps and starting with just a digital map, and then as our museum grew with contacts in archaeology and history and anthropology and even like computer science and other interdisciplinary spaces, we were able to go on field work, and our main port of contact was a man, Anthony Minor, who works at National Museums of Kenya, and he was a curator at Nyeri Museum, which is the region where the converted camps are, and he has all this knowledge about the camps and about the emergency and about the pipeline, and he was basically crucial in talking to veterans and visiting sites and collaborating with like staff at the schools as well. So, for example, when we went to Kangaberi School, we and Anthony, we spoke to the staff there, and we said, you have all this, you have this legacy of the camp, and you have all this this physical material, and there's like a lot that you could do with it in terms of preserving it, or working with veterans, or working with the students and things like that. And they were happy for us to go around, but they had a lot of concerns about how the hell are they going to tell the students that they're sleeping in like in solitary confinement cells, and also funding basically, and how if they were to preserve the camp or the camp's buildings, like how they wouldn't be able to afford the upkeep, and that was their main concern. And yeah, so in terms of methodology, we really have learnt to listen more to the concerns of people, because when we visited veterans, all of them were really happy to be able to tell their story and to be able to get it out there, because they're very often not listened to. But sometimes we have to sort of take a step back and be like, sometimes it's not feasible to, preserve the camps.
I'm going to come over to this side of the room now, and it would also be really useful if anyone has any responses to Francesca's point about critical reflection. That would also be interesting as well, because it does vary from field to field. There are some disciplines where that form of insertion into writing would be taboo. And in others, such as feminist research and methodology, where it's expected. And then there's some in-between spaces that I've encountered myself, where I've had, back when I was doing my PhD, a concern that I was always required to be reflective, whereas white writers were not. So I'm also interested in that balance as well. So any questions or comments on this side of the room? Jonna? Go ahead.
I just had a question about, both of you articulated this, a story that's not told, facts that remain unknown. So, our relative ignorance about history and colonial legacies, and right up to the present day of Nitrate, but also about Mama. And therefore, my question is about in the engagement, in this sort of activist part where you are trying to engage with those people who do not know. What is the kind of strategy there? I just know, and again, if I'm being reflexive, in my own work on finance, a lot of people don't know a lot about finance, right? And when you try to explain to them, no, it's not savers and borrowers and people lend money, no, I don't know that. And it's like a threat to them, what they don't know.
Yes.
And if we think about knowledge practices and methodological practices, this is quite different, for example, in the hard sciences, right? To discover something unknown, right? I mean, that's what, I found a box and on all this unknown information, and now I have a whole new piece of the puzzle that we didn't know. That would be celebrated. But there's something about where we are epistemologically as well, where bringing new or untold stories or unrecognized parts of history is now a very dangerous business, because now it's a very threatening pose. It's not about our collective human history, or and it's always seen in a threatening way. So I know that in the academic side, but how is it when you're trying to engage in more activist circles to kind of, I don't know what the right metaphor is here about, piercing the unknown and making it visible, or making silences heard.
Yeah, so in Chile, if I do Chile and London, and also Chile's different. So in Iquique, there are the museums of nitrate. So there is a heritage, but it's quite a sanitized version, and it's one that promotes. It's quite interesting, the kind of the body of the male worker in particular as national strength. So there's a left and there's a national Chilean history that sort of circulates around a nitrate worker, but quite silent about the implications of that. So depoliticised in the sense that it's been depoliticised from the coup, I suppose, to some extent. So, but that's changing a bit in Chile. And Chile is unlike Argentina. So Argentina's memory culture is much more vibrant and much more insistent. Chile, they're much quieter, and people will even say, you don't know what we were facing when Pinochet got in. So, which is a metaphor for we were going to be communists, and what we had, a dictatorship, was kind of better than that. So there's some silence, but Chile, the nitrate story is known. And it's known as a future lost in a way. It's the future. So that's one of the ways in which the future is lost, which it is lost through mining. Every time you dig something out of the ground, you cannot put it up, so you lose the future. So there is that sort of debate in Chile, but in Britain, probably not known at all. And so if I tell one short story, the one piece of work I'm doing at the moment is in Silvertown. I don't know if people know Silvertown, East London. So it's kind of I don't know if gentrification is the right word, but it's got the architectural gentrification where the city buildings have moved south to the waste Docklands area, And part of the waste docklands area was one of the shell filling, it's a Brunamond factory that was used to fill shells in the First World War, and it exploded and 73 people died. And that's been commemorated, not big style, it's not known widely, but in local communities. Not a single word about the origin of the material. So there's not even an erasure, because I kept thinking I'm going to look and I might see a trace. There's nothing about Chilean labour, even though actually the labouring stories might not be dissimilar. Could be, you could do some interesting work about, labour on both sides of the world, but nothing. And so in the moment of gentrification or of development or of transformation of a local economy into a global one, people have marked the loss of the London working class. And I'm thinking about ways of inscribing the Chilean story into that story. So it's a bit like, it's like I want to be critical because there's nostalgia for a lost working class, of which, it's not so very far away from actually my family would have been. They grew up in Peckham. So there's that nostalgia in the face of gentrification, the transformation of London, but not... it always was a global space. The London Docklands were a global space, since forever. So I wanted to reinscribe a global history when a local history is being reascribed against global capital. So I'm left with that triangulation, and I'd like to do something around that without upsetting the kind of claims of the local against the global gentrifiers in London. So that's one. Does that help? And I'm thinking about that and how that could be done in terms of activism.
So I think you're taking your uncomfortableness about the discursive way in which you understand local history to...
Nobody's feeling uncomfortable because nobody knows. Nobody knows or cares. Nobody knows or cares, so nobody's feeling uncomfortable at all. Everybody's just fine.
So I was wondering, Hannah, with the museums project, you brought up a couple of points that I thought were quite applicable to what Jonna was asking, because you were saying there's some people who didn't even know their own ancestral links.
Yeah.
So what happens when they're, I suppose, encouraged or even compelled to face this sort of thing? And you were talking about the two different sites where in one location school children were aware and in another location school children weren't.
Yeah.
So, how does this happen? How do you then achieve balance within Kenya itself?
Yeah, that is one of our main concerns. I wasn't on the fieldwork trip in Kenya, so this is more sort of second hand. But so when, as I said, when we speak to veterans, they're often very happy to tell their story because they're often not listened to, or when they are, it reaches like the standard paper in Kenya, and then not far from that.
I know you're sort of reaching into other people's sort of memories.
Yeah, I haven't really experienced it myself, so maybe it's a better question for one of our co-founders. But.
And then I wondered, so from Britain's perspective, with a physical museum space, you anticipate that every once in a while, I hope every once in a while, curators are wandering around trying to sense what sort of feedback they're getting from people. How do you get a sense of how Britons are engaging with the museum so far?
So we thankfully we haven't had that much of pushback, I guess, from Britons. Olivia likes to say we're still in the sort of Twitter bubble.
Yes.
Where people where
everyone thinks this is a good thing.
Yeah, basically. Personally, the people I've spoken to outside of the Twitter bubble, so for example, I spoke to my grandma about it because her family's Irish. And I was saying, we're working with the Pat Finucane Centre in Northern Ireland in Derry, and we're working on, we're hoping to work more in Ireland on colonialism. And her response was like, no, it didn't happen. Like, colonialism didn't exist. It's like, oh, okay. And so, personally, I still am trying to figure out how to respond to things like that. I mean, you can throw as much information as you want at people, like people who are still willfully ignorant. But a lot of the time, like you said, it's threatening to them, I suppose.
Yes.
So, yeah.
I think this actually links also with Francesca's point, because I'm sure for those of us who are researchers or activists or both, we have had these conversations with our families where we're explaining what we do and they have no idea why we're doing it. So I think for a lot of people that absolutely resonates. Any more questions from this side of the room? Yes.
I'd just like to add to that, because I think that, okay, so I went to the Academy to do my PhD in my mature years, and so
Yes.
I've got a lot of experience to draw on. One of the things that is really important to me is diversifying my audience.
Yes.
So for many years, my academic peers, my filmmaking peers, and everybody else was outside of that, including family. And I found it really useful to bring those audiences together in my research, in speaking sessions, discussions. And what I find is that, one, it sort of raises the status that I'm doing in my family's eyes because they get it in that context.
Yeah.
Two, it sort of regulates the types of conversations that might be set by an academic agenda, because they're speaking to a more diverse audience. And three, people get to know each other.
Yes.
You know, across the spectrum, which is really nice for me, and I can sort of relax within my practice, knowing that my family knows what I'm doing, and then my academic friends and peers and colleagues understand my family situation as well. So I find it very liberating to be able to have some sort of agency in inviting people in to discuss a space, and intergenerationally as well it works.
Yes.
The young members of the family are inspired, because there are things they understand about the practice. They're inspired to take some ideas further. So yeah, I'd say the more diversified audiences.
What I find so interesting about what you said is, you know, I spent much of my life living in quite a small city, Kingston, Jamaica, and then became a Londoner. So I've been a Londoner for nearly 20 years. And I was always very struck by the fact that Londoners tend to have very compartmentalized lives. So they are very, very used, no matter what sort of profession or vocation they're in organizing events where it's for that group of people that they know and for that group of people. And they never bring their different groups of people together, for fear, I think, of having a composite identity that might actually scare you yourselves. So I think it is very interesting just thinking about it from a Londoner perspective. How would you approach your own work in that way? Because what might happen if your mother had a conversation with the people that you work with or the people that you've been doing research with? I would fear it, because my mother's pretty fearful. But it would be really interesting. So, you know, I would... Yeah, you sent me a challenge. Any other? Yes, did you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, and to Joanne's provocation on the other end. To be blunt, and I'm Nadine, I'm presenting tomorrow. I put poetry right in with my academic work. I do not fool around with that. I am really clear about making sure that everyone can find an entry point into the work that I'm doing. It certainly drifts it down where it seems like I've dumbed it down. I don't have a capacity for academic language or theory, but it's actually quite deliberate. My grandmother must always understand what I'm talking about, always. Anything that is designed to make her feel stupid has to be destroyed, as far as I'm concerned. I'm really fierce about that, and I betray my growing up in a university background, you know, all the time, because I'm just like, that's great, yeah, I grew up in the back end of a university as a kid of a librarian, but that thing there has to be destroyed. So yeah, which scares academics when I actually openly say that in conferences. They get really freaked out, and that's fine. But I wanted to really thank both of you on talking about the psychic elements of doing this work, because often what happens is, and in doing Indigenous studies in Canada, really what you're being asked to do is drop off of a cliff and shatter. Okay, that's really what it is. Everything you thought you knew, the sugar in the bottom of your teacup, as Stuart Hall would say, like that's completely that pleasure of knowing self or feeling congruent is smashed. So I really appreciate the audience speaking about this and this being spoken to on ghosts, because for the folks that are in the audience that might be new to this, speaking to one young man, he's like, I do finance and this stuff is all new, putting struggle together with, you know, with this academic stuff, you know, he had to go. Like, these are the things that aren't talked about, you know, the way Saidiya Hartman writes Scenes of Subjugation, and then later prints Losing Your Mother, which is basically her psychic journal of doing scenes of subjugation, but having to split them because you'd never be published if you actually put that in. So I just want to thank you around, like, just speaking around these risks and what it takes to talk about it, because and Judah for talking about how do we bring that, you know, how do we bring people together, because otherwise then it just becomes the room and then we don't know how to talk about it, right? Unless we all find each other. And the point of this all is to keep the shift. I'm doing dangerous work. I'm asking my community how our settlement in unceded territory, like how we're implicated in an entanglement. And so when I talk to my elders, who I know, like, have dealt with displacement so many times, like, those are psychic risks. So I just want to let people who are, you know, white in the audience might be thinking, well, we're the only ones struggling with this. No, like, other people are struggling with those things and struggling how to not be an anthropologist and grabbing up other people's knowledge and putting it out there so it looks like it's mine. I accrue social capital in academic world, but the people who actually happen to, like, are in the shadows somewhere. These are all things that, like, academics of all colors have to wrestle with, and I'm always interested in those conversations. So thank you, Louise, for really speaking about ghosts in that regard and how you navigate witnessing versus.
We started about 8 minutes late, so if we grab back about 3 or 4, that should be okay. Are there any more?
I wanted to say something about ghosts, and because I actually do track between my everyday life and my academic life, and I want to be honest about that. And I think that even the most rational of us who've not read Avery Gordon and found a way of speaking that, we do believe that people exist in things, because when you drop a cup that belonged to your mother, you just think it's a loss, it's a bereavement, and we wear jewellery that our ancestors wore. We might not call them our ancestors, so we are surrounded in our global, financial, rational hell with another everyday life where we always respect the dead. And that's part of our human condition. And I think that it's, and anthropologists find a way of writing about that in their work, but actually it's, if we move as we cycle or we walk or we get the bus between our homes and our work, we don't always shed all of that stuff, you know, we don't always, so we do. And I think some of that kind of, is kind of what I mean about integrity is a sense of honesty of being a person in history, of your personhood, and all that means is quite important for doing this sort of work, really, without losing our minds in the process, because we have to try and keep hold of some of ourselves, I would say. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Just before, yes, Max.
I just want to make a kind of curatorial call here, which is that I think what this discussion has awakened is and revealed is how much complexity and richness and depth and urgency there is in these kind of tools that have been developed in a whole variety of fields, and also activist projects to speak about the complexities of dealing with the past and the past's impact on the present. And as we move forward in the next day and a half or day or so, I'm curious then how those who are listening from the perspective whose methodologies are more quantitative, whose methodologies deal with numbers, whose methodologies need to please a certain disciplinary master that demands a certain type of proof. What we really wanted, in one of the ways, one of our primary goals in organizing was to see if we can bring these methodologies into dialogue, because we urgently need both right now.
Yes.
And I'm someone who comes from a humanities background, so it's an open question for me.
Okay.
So curatorial.
But, I mean, I live the methodological question because in my own discipline, I am an outsider. I've only just recently found out it's a reason I never get appointed to editorial boards in my fields, because I'm not a quant. I write about finance, but I'm not a quant, so, you know, I couldn't matter. So it's a constant debate, you know, that there is a whole area of methodology that is venerated, so the rest of us need to go present in other forms of conferences and disciplines, which is a terrible way for a field to attempt to develop. So I would be really interested if people do keep bringing this back up. I did just want to end, first of all, by saying thank you very much to the speakers, who I think deserve a fabulous round of applause for sharing.